Good morning. We're at the beginning of a weird winter. A World Cup in the sweltering heat of Qatar, and back home, the threat of strikes causing trouble everywhere you look. One out, all out.
Students and staff, unite and fight!
Is that what we're all in for? Nurses will strike.
They have chosen strike over listening to our nursing staff.
Train workers too.
This latest round of strikes will show how important our members are to the running of the country.
Teachers and lecturers have already left the classroom.
We have burnout workloads in education. The system is unsustainable.
Relations between the unions and the government are in the deep freeze.
What the unions are asking for, I think, is a 19% pay rise. That's obviously unaffordable.
They are all struggling with a cost of living crisis made in Downing Street.
While tensions over human rights hot up at the World Cup. We have one big question this morning. Are we heading to a winter of discontent? Can the Transport Secretary Mark Harper end the chaos on the railways? We'll ask him live. With a whole series of strikes coming, we'll hear from Labour's Lisa Nandy on where her party stands. And here's our crack panel to respond to those interviews and take us through the day's news. Maths professor and presenter Hannah Fry, Tory MP and until not so long ago chair of the Conservative Party Jake Berry, and the boss of the trade union movement Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC. Now, hello and a very good morning to you. Let's start with this morning's front pages. Let's take a look. There we have it on the front page of the Express, talking about migrants being housed in forces homes. The Observer suggesting that a landmark new trade deal with Japan is a blow to Brexit because there's been a trade slump. The Sunday Telegraph talking about long waits in accident and emergency, something we talked about a lot last week. And there, on the front page of Scotland on Sunday, a picture of Doddy Weir in action, the former Scottish rugby international turned campaigner across the country for the disease that sadly took his life, motor neurone disease, but someone who created a lot of pride and a lot of sadness this weekend as he's finally passed away. Welcome to my panel. A huge amount to talk about this morning, so thank you all for being here today. We're going to be talking a lot about strikes. Francis, when it comes to the rail strikes, can anything be done to avert a whole series of action in the run-up to Christmas?
There's always a deal to be done, and it takes goodwill, good faith and people around the table, but it also takes clarity. And I think, you know, after Grant Shapps' somewhat macho style of saying it's nothing to do with him, we've had a change of tone from Mark Harper. But what the unions need to know is whether the companies have authority to do a deal, because we know that every train operating company has a clause in its contract written by the government on dispute handling, but the unions don't know what's in it, and they don't know whether the companies have authority, have been empowered to actually genuinely, in good faith, negotiate a deal. So what we're hoping for from Mark Harper is a letter to the unions, setting that out and being clear not just about facilitating the deal, but what the government's role in settling it is.
Well, Francis, I hear that's a big clang of a gauntlet being laid down for the Transport Secretary. We can put that to him in just a few minutes' time. I mean, Jake is a Conservative MP, but also a passionate representative of a Northern constituency, and you're chair of the Northern Research Group, sort of gang of Tory Northern backbenchers. Do you accept that as things stand, rail strikes and the state of rail services, particularly in the north of England, has let your voters down?
Yeah, I mean, look, I keep wondering with the Vanti West Coast, it is so bad. I'm thinking that if Matt Hancock wins the jungle, we can see if he can survive one journey between London and Manchester on an Avanti train. It's absolutely appalling. There used to be 3 trains an hour from Stockport, where I get on when I'm coming from home to London. There's now 1 an hour. It's often delayed. So the rail network is in a real mess, and we particularly feel that in the north with sort of a creaking and aged system. What I think is really interesting is the government has slightly changed its approach, and it gives me great hope for settlement. Grant Shapps had a sort of not me gov approach. He refused to sort of get involved directly in the negotiations.
Was that a mistake?
I think that was a big mistake, actually. I'm really pleased that our new Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, is taking a much more active role. He's volunteered, I think, for the Rail Minister to attend some of the talks next week. And that gives me real hope for settlement because, of course, Mick Grinch, as we now have to call him, is going to cancel all of our Christmases.
Well, he's denied that
he is going to stop us
we'll
going
see.
home to see our family unless we get this issue sorted.
You know, strikes are a symptom, they're not the cause. The cause here is about protecting jobs, about protecting safety, about people's work-life balance, and of course having fair pay. This is an industry that's made £500 million worth of profit, and staff, quite rightly, who worked through COVID want their fair share.
And we've got plenty of time to get into that and some of the other strikes a little bit later in the programme. But Hannah, to introduce you to the audience, I mean, you're a presenter but professor of maths, and one of the things I'm intrigued about is your official title is Professor of Mathematics in Cities. When it comes to transport, does that play into that study?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I don't think that the maths can sort of solve this kind of stuff, to be clear.
No other way has been found so far.
I mean, surely you can do that calculation.
Somebody who did the sums on profits and wages.
But you can certainly look at the way that people are using something like a train network or a tube network and look for inefficiencies and look for vulnerabilities and sort of look at it from that mathematical perspective.
Okay, very interesting. Well, maybe we have some tips from Mark Harper a bit later on. And you've been crunching the numbers around the World Cup too. So we'll get some mathematical predictions for that all-important England and Wales game a bit later in the programme. Now, while we're on air, as if by magic, the live page on the BBC website is being updated with the most important bits of the interviews and analysis of what they mean. So if you're watching and scrolling, as some people do these days, that'll be there right now, and after the show I'll be scribbling some of my thoughts there too. You know where it is, at bbc.co.uk/news. Now, it's not unreasonable to expect to be able to get from A to B in this country without too much grief, but we all know it doesn't feel like that with a series of rail strikes that have dragged on since June. The RMT Rail Union has announced even more days when they'll down tools stretching beyond Christmas. Unlike his predecessor, Grant Shapps, as we've just been discussing, the new current Transport Secretary met with the union chief, Mick Lynch, this week. Well, did it get them much closer to sorting things out?
We need pace. 6 months we've been negotiating at least with the train operators, and we have had not one document put across the table. That has to change, and I outlined to him what his responsibilities are as we see them. And his responsibilities are legally, in the contracts they have with these train operators, he has got a legal responsibility for industrial relations and a responsibility to set their mandate, i.e. what they can say, what they can offer and what they can negotiate on at that table.
Well, the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, is here. Can you clear up whose job is it to fix this?
Well, look, the negotiations are absolutely between the trade unions and the train operating companies and Network Rail. So, and I'm not getting involved in those detailed negotiations, but I do think I have a responsibility to encourage and help the two sides in those negotiations to reach a conclusion so that we can modernise the rail system and we can have reform of the way the workforce operates and we can have a train network that is properly fit for the 21st century.
It's a bit more than that though, isn't it, Secretary of State? I mean, you do have a responsibility for holding the purse strings and for setting the parameters for the negotiations, the mandate that Francis O'Grady was just talking about.
Well, look, clearly there's a lot of taxpayers' money that goes into the rail network, but look, this dispute is actually a little bit different from some of the other ones you mentioned, and these talks have been going on for some time. So what we need to try and to fix here is we're trying to modernise how the workforce operates and the detail of how those rail companies operate. Now, if we can get that agreement between the trade unions and the companies, the detailed negotiations hammered out, what that does is it frees up financial savings, and then that money can be shared between the taxpayer and the workers, and there'll obviously be a discussion to be had about the balance of that, but it's getting those reforms agreed, that frees up some resources, and then that will enable the Network Rail and the train operating companies then to make a pay offer to the people that work in the industry.
And that's your ambition for what should happen, but there's a big question about how that could happen. Now, we've just heard from Francis O'Grady, and also the RMT union have been saying that too. They feel the train operators have not been able to make offers to them because the government hasn't given them the flexibility to do so. Do you dispute that?
No, look, I haven't blocked anything, and it's not in my interest to block anything.
Did your predecessor block anything?
But there's a thing that has to be done here, which is you need the reforms agreed, because it's the reforms being agreed that free up the savings that can be then be used to make a pay offer. So both of those things have to happen in parallel. Look, there's been quite a lot of progress made, to be fair. The trade unions have negotiated with the train operating companies and Network Rail. Quite a lot of work has been done, and I want to try and work with both sides to try and help them get that over the line.
But will you,
on
as
behalf of the travelling public and the taxpayer?
But as the Secretary of State, will you give the companies flexibility to make offers, to have a proper backwards and forwards? Because that is what has to happen here, isn't it? You have to budge so the companies can then budge.
What has to happen is we have to agree on a set of reforms. It's the reforms that free up the savings that then unlock the ability for the companies to make an offer to the trade unions on pay. Both of those things have to happen in parallel. So look, where I want to try and get to, why I've got involved, why I met Mick Lynch and I met one of the other union leaders this week, Frank Ward, and I'm going to meet the others, is just to try and facilitate that process, encourage both sides to hammer out that deal to reach a solution for passengers. You know, you talked to Jake about what the experiences of passengers. So I have two responsibilities. One is to the people that use the rail service, and I've also got a responsibility to the taxpayer to get value for the money that we put into it.
Again, you know, that's the responsibility that you feel. But in terms of actually making this happen, getting these strikes called off, one of the union bosses, Kevin Lindsay from ASLEF, said that the government, this is a political dispute because the government has not allowed the train operating companies to negotiate and put an offer to them. Is that not true?
No, look, there's been a lot of negotiation already on the detail. Where we've got to get to is we've got to lock down that reform package because it's only the savings that free up the resources to make the pay offer.
But that sounds like you're saying no more money unless there's agreement on reforms. Yeah,
we've absolutely got to have reform. The rail system at the moment, we've had 20% of passengers have not come back post-COVID. And that means the system isn't financially sustainable as it is. And also, we've got to have a more flexible railway. Part of the issues that Jake was talking about on Avanti West Coast and on Trans-Pennine Express, it's to do with driver shortage, but it's also to do with the fact we don't have a proper 7-day railway. We have days in the week where train services are completely dependent on the goodwill of people coming in to work on their day off. That isn't how you run a modern railway that people can depend on for running their daily lives.
There is, though, Mark Harper, great variation in that, and in the north of England, actually, 13% of people have difference, which is a different thing. But I just want to press you again on this specific. We hear basically your deal, your quid pro quo. There could be more cash if there's reform that saves that cash. But on the specific question, you as the new Transport Secretary, are you going to give the train operators flexibility to do a deal? Are you going to change the mandate, which is the technical term, for what you're asking them to do?
Yeah, look, the train operating companies and Network Rail will have the ability to reach a deal, but we have to be able to have that reform package negotiated because it's only that throws up the savings. I do not have a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money to throw at this problem. And by the way, it would be the wrong thing to do. You know, your viewers are very well aware of the massive challenge facing the country due to and I disagree with one of the bits that was in your opening titles. This challenge that we're facing, the economic challenge, it's made in Russia. It's to do with the massive challenge facing the country from the huge amount of extra money that we're having to pay for energy.
And that
sets
your
an economic context,
overall economic argument,
which we have to have when we're
from what you've been saying this
arrangements.
morning, it sounded a little hint there that you might change the mandate and give train operators more flexibility. But although you've come in with a different tone to your predecessor at the Transport Department, it sounds like you're not really willing to budge that far to get these strikes called off.
Well, look, it's a negotiation, which Francis laid out very clearly, and it's about locking down some details of reforms, which then frees up the resources, and then there'll be a sensible discussion between the unions and the employers about how you fairly distribute that between the people that work in the industry, who I accept they were key workers, they kept the industry going during the pandemic. By the way, the taxpayer did their side of it as well. We put £16 billion into the rail
huge
industry,
amount of money.
£160,000 per rail worker, £600 for every family listening, in the country. That was a deal. I think we can get a deal, and I want to try and get a deal to stop these damaging strikes, which are only going to put people off using the railways and damage the long-term future of the industry.
Chance
and that's
of a deal
in no
before
one's
Christmas?
interesting. Well, look, I would like there to be a resolution of the dispute, and I would like the strikes to be called off. They're going to hit families, and they're going to hit the hospitality industry, and I want to protect that as well.
Okay, there were serious problems with transport in this country before these strikes. There were serious problems with transport in this country before the pandemic. So let's take a look at the state of some of this transport. Our viewers have been getting in touch with us about some of their experiences, and this is a travel story from Emily, a viewer. She lives near Manchester. I believe we can hopefully look at what she's got to say. Yeah, I'm a new mum back at work in Manchester. I can no longer rely on the train to work. It's severely reduced and always has huge delays. I risk not being able to pick my baby up from nursery in the evening. What is the plan to sort out trains in the north, quite separately from strikes?
Well, look, I mentioned both of those two services which are delivering pool services. There's two things. One is there's a big driver shortage that was partly exacerbated by a lack of training during the pandemic. We're working very closely with both of those train operating companies to get more drivers trained, and the new timetables that will come into place in December will hopefully see better services that people can rely on. But fundamentally, this comes back to reform. Part of the problem here, the reason why those services have been so unreliable, is they depend on goodwill, and they depend on people working on their days off. And that is not a way of a sustainable system. What Emily needs is a train service that has frequent services that she can rely on, which is why we need to deliver workforce reform.
This is a massive problem. I mean, it's not just about Emily. There are hundreds of thousands of trains were cancelled last year, 860 a day on average from the watchdog. Those are their statistics. If I'm a passenger, especially in the north of England, how am I supposed to get around? And you can sit here this morning, Secretary of State, and say, oh, we need to have reform. Your party's been in charge of this for 12 years.
Well, look, I agree there's a problem, and
it's got worse.
And since I've been doing this job, I'm determined to grip this, deliver that reform to the way the rail workforce operates. I want to make sure the benefits of that are shared fairly between the taxpayer and the people that work in the industry.
What does that mean to travellers?
Well, it means they will have...
who right now feel they can't get to work, they feel they can't go away at the weekend, they can't rely on a service that should be there for them, that the taxpayers poured millions of pounds into.
It means that we'll have more drivers trained. It means you'll have a proper 7-day railway with a timetable that can be counted upon. We're not going to change all that overnight, but are we making progress? Yes, we are, and I'm determined to do it, because I want the only thing that's going to work for passengers and indeed people in the industry is a reliable service to see more passengers coming back to the railway. If those 20% of people that used to use the railways never come back, we're not going to have as many services as we have now. I want to grow the railway, have a successful railway.
But on one of those specific...
And we're going to continue investing in it.
But on one of those specifics, and Jake mentioned it, Emily mentioned it, a service between one of our great cities in Manchester used to be 3 an hour, it's now 1 an hour. Can you tell people this morning they will see their services come back?
Yeah, well, one of the things that the new timetables are going to have is going to have an increase in services, and I want to make sure those are services people can count on, which is why it's very important. It was also, by the way, very important in the autumn statement that my capital budget and my budget I have for maintaining the trains
restored? And on that specific one, there used to be 3, now there's only 1 an hour. Go back to 3?
More services available in the timetable that set out, the Avanti West Coast timetable that set out in December. And what I'm hoping, if we can modernise the railways and the way they work in terms of the workforce reform, is that those will be timetables that people can count on to do their everyday lives, as Emily was saying in her message there.
Do you think people have to get used to having fewer services, but if they're reliable, would it be better to have fewer services people could count on?
Well, I think services people can count on is clearly what we want, but we want to increase the level of services that are available, and that's why we're investing in new railways, we're investing in maintaining the ones we've got, but we also need to modernise the way the workforce operates so that we can have services that people can count on and have a great railway.
One of the things that is maybe not discussed very much in Westminster, but really matters to our viewers and people around the country, are the level of bus services. Now, there are examples all over the country of bus services being cut, in your own constituency. We've also found there's a few problems going on there. Why are things getting so much worse? I mean, over the last decade, Britain's bus services lost 134 miles of services. This is getting worse on your watch.
Well, look, I'm very conscious that 94% of journeys that people make every day are on the roads, whether in their own cars or on buses, and I'm going to make sure when we look at our budgets and where we spend our money that we take that into account. Now look, we have had issues with buses. They have been exacerbated, just like trains, by the pandemic. Again, we've seen something like a third of bus passengers are no longer using buses. That has a real impact, particularly in rural areas, as you said. I have similar issues in my own about services that are not viable. The government stepped in to provide a grant to help operators with all the challenges of COVID. We extended that to the end of March next year. And what we're looking at, we'll look at what more we need to do, but we're also looking at other ways of delivering services, particularly rural areas. We're doing pilots on what's called demand responsive transport, so that's more flexible services that respond to where people actually want to use them. And I think we need to try some of those things. So I'm very conscious, for those people that don't have cars, in rural areas particularly, they need to be able to get to work, get to all the important things they need to do, their hospital appointments, and I'm very much conscious that we need to reorganise how we deliver that to deliver those services.
Will you commit though to increasing the number of services available for people?
Well, I want to make sure people have the services they need.
That wasn't my question. Are you committing to increase the level of services?
I want to make sure people have the services they need, but also I'd say we've got to get people back using buses again, because all the commercial services that operate, the ones that don't require subsidy from local councils, those all depend on a certain number of people using them. And if people don't use them, a lot of those services are not sustainable. That's one of the challenges we're seeing at the moment.
And what's happening on the railways, Mark Harper, with these strikes is in the context of multiple disputes in multiple industries, whether that's nurses, teachers in Scotland, junior doctors balloting to go on strike. There are strikes in the private sector as well. University lecturers have been out this week. That kind of level of unrest, does that give our viewers an impression of a country that's being well run?
Well, look, I think what it gives you the impression is that we face some big economic challenges. We've seen inflation rise, largely made in Russia, to do with the big spike in energy prices and, of course, the global economy getting back on track after the pandemic.
And you've made that point, but this is about people's wages. So
but the reason why people are dissatisfied with their wages is because inflation is very high. The most important thing the government can do, which is why the Chancellor set out the measures he did in the autumn statement, is to get inflation under control, because that is actually at the root cause of a lot of this industrial unrest.
But why should public sector workers accept getting poorer?
Look,
that's what's happening here.
We have to balance what is affordable. So that's, for example, why in the health service we've accepted all the recommendations of the independent pay review body, which would give, for example, I think a nurse at least a £1,400 pay rise this year, and it's why nurses, for example, got a 3% rise last year when the general public sector had a pay freeze. But a 19% pay rise simply isn't affordable.
Hang on a second.
And we have to balance what is affordable, the difficult decisions we're having to make to keep the public finances under control, and also the perfectly reasonable requests that people have got to keep up with the cost of living. But I accept that people are not going to be able to have what they want.
Except though, Secretary of State, barristers went out on strike and barristers got a pay rise of 15%. So why is it fair for barristers in one profession to get 15% from a government deal and nurses to be told, no way, we can't afford it?
Well, I think I'm not going to get into the detail of individual cases, because there's some complexity there, I think, around the barristers one about history and about what they're offering for the money.
I think nurses would say there's quite a lot of history too. I mean, there are figures from the TUC that suggest in real terms a nurse right now is actually thousands of pounds less well off in real terms than in 2010.
Well, look, the health workers, like doctors and nurses, there's an independent pay review body which takes evidence both from the government, but it also takes evidence from the profession, it takes evidence from users of the services, and it makes recommendations about what it thinks is a fair pay rise. It did that in the case of the health service, and the government accepted all of those recommendations in full, and that's what we've offered to people.
If you were a nurse or a teacher or a hospital porter or anybody else who works in the public sector this morning listening to you and thinking, you know what, I hear the minister telling me there's no more money because the country is strapped for cash. Actually, I think I might leave and go and do something else to get more money. What would your advice be to them?
Well, look, I would urge them not to do that. I would say what we're trying to do is to get inflation under control, to drive it down. That is the best thing that we can do. If you end up,
the best thing for them and their family might be to do something else. What if people watching this morning think, I cannot pay my bills if I stay in this job?
Well, look, one of the things we've done, look, we're trying to give people the support they need for energy prices, for example. One of the big challenges that those families are going to have is how to pay their energy bill. That's why the government is spending £100 billion of taxpayers' money this year and next to give families a considerable amount of support to help with their energy bills. That's going to be one of the biggest things that has gone up between last year and this year. So it's not only that people are having to look at what they're getting in the pay packet, they're also getting a significant amount of help from the taxpayer to help with one of the biggest bills, as I said, both this year and next year, to give them the confidence to plan their finances. But I accept, given the level of inflation, you know, people are still going to find it very difficult, and the government is doing what it can to do that.
And it is going to be difficult, no question.
Without getting inflation to go up out of control. The most important thing for people is we grip inflation, we get it under control, and that's going to put us on the right path for a sustainable economic future.
So just, we're almost out of time, but just as you accept it's going to be a difficult time for lots of families and lots of people watching this morning, it's quite a difficult time already for the new government, or newish government that you're part of. You've got Tory rebels trying to kill off your housing plans. You've got other Tory rebels trying to force Rishi Sunak to think again on onshore wind, which just happens to include a couple of former prime ministers. And you've got Tory MPs saying they're not going to stand at the next election. Do you think people will be looking at you thinking that's a group of people who know how to win an election, look like government in control?
Well, look, I think what the public want from the government, look, I accept that things are not easy at the moment. I don't think the Prime Minister thought things were going to be easy, you know, when he was campaigning over the summer. I think what people want from their government is, we've got a whole load of challenges thrown at us from international events, which are also faced by every other country in the world. I think
some you've brought on yourselves.
I think what they want is a government that grips them, is honest and straightforward with people about the challenges we face, the choices we face, and then lays out to people with some level of honesty the decisions we've made and where we can reasonably expect to get to. And I think if we continue to do that sustainably, people will look at the government and think, actually, these people are gripping the challenges facing the country, they know what they're doing, and I'm confident that the future will look brighter, and that they'll give us that confidence again when we ask them to place that trust in us at the next election.
Just lastly, somewhat curiously, Labour wants to help you out actually with one of the things that's going wrong. They're offering to vote with you on your housing plans. Would you accept that kind offer?
Well, I think Labour's not really trying to help us out. I think Michael Gove's going to be talking to colleagues in the days and weeks to come, listen to a range of opinions, and I'm sure he'll reach the right conclusion on his very important levelling up and regeneration bill.
Okay, Mark Harper, Secretary of State for Transport. Pleasure. Great to have you in the studio for the first time. Come back soon. Thank you very much. Well, did we manage to untangle anything of whose job it really is to try to get these train strikes resolved? Let's ask Francis O'Grady, who threw the gauntlet down to the Transport Secretary, I suppose also to me, to try to get a straight answer. Any clearer, Francis, about who's really in the driving seat?
Well, I think we're seeing this across the piece, with the government pointing the finger at independent review bodies or train operating companies, but it feels like the government is pulling the strings, and indeed that's what employers in the rail industry told us. So I think there was some reassurance there, but we'll see what happens on Monday and whether or not the rail unions get that letter and what's in the letter. But there has to be some recognition that, as Mark Harper said himself, this is about political choices. We've seen the cap lifted on bankers' bonuses, but nurses' pay driven down. We could give every public servant in this country an inflation-proof pay rise if we equalised capital gains tax on selling shares and second homes with income tax. That would raise enough money. So these are political choices, and the government's got to be clear whose side it's on.
Jane,
working people are struggling.
You look a bit sceptical listening to Francis there with what might sound to lots of viewers like an easy solution.
Well, look, I mean, the first thing is, it's a really hard job that Mark has. He was going into the detail, and actually the detail is quite dull. It's much easier if you're a trade union leader to say our members want a pay rise, everyone's feeling the pinch. But a lot of the points he was making about how we have to have reform in our transport system is really, really important. It's how you do release some of those savings that enable people to get a pay rise. Look, my general view on taxation is we've got the highest tax burden for 70 years. It is possible. It's in pantomime season. It's pantomime season, so I'll say it. It is possible to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And if we keep pushing and pushing and pushing wealth
but
creators,
not wealth.
Well, no, if you keep pushing and pushing wealth creators, you know, we live in a global economy, and I do think we've already seen changes in decisions due to new tax rises. We saw Shell ditch a £20 billion plus investment in the United Kingdom because of the windfall tax. If you keep sort of putting taxes up, we will lose the ability.
Shareholders have risen 3 times faster than wages. Something has gone wrong in Britain. It's broken. We're seeing more and more wealth go to the top, and ordinary working families are not able to heat their homes and give their children a proper start in life. Something has gone wrong.
I also have to disagree with you about the fact that the detail is dull. And maybe this is just, you know, right.
Says the professor.
I know. Come on. Says my mind. But, you know, I think what was really noticeable there was that he was talking about how this is an economic crisis that was started in Russia. And, of course, the Russian crisis has exacerbated things, but we were existing in a system that was so fragile that one shock like that and everything completely falls apart. You know, this goes back much longer. You know, A&E waiting lists, nurses, all of these things. And I agree with you. I think it is about prioritising and working out what kind of country we want to live in.
Jake, how do you think... Well, do you want to come in?
Well, I mean, just on you know, it's a political problem for the government. It's actually, I'm quite interested, but I'm a politician. But I think for the general public, you know, the working practices and whether people are compelled to work on a Sunday or a Saturday and whether they can swap a day in and out for a day working at the weekend, I just don't think that's particularly interesting. But I do think the problem...
One of those
well, I completely agree with that. But
somebody wants to get a train at the weekend.
But I think the real problem the government has is that this plays into a wider argument about competence. So actually, you know, what people care about is, I turned up at the train station, is the train there? Does it run on time? Can I, you know, is the shop open on the train? Can I go and see my loved ones at Christmas? And whatever the details is, whatever the rights or wrongs, the danger is to the government, if you lose that argument on competence, you lose the public.
And right now, do you think your colleagues in government are looking competent to most members of the public?
Well, look, I think it's challenging times, and I think some of them are. I thought Mark...
Challenging times. That's a very polite way of saying absolutely not. I mean, let's look in some of the papers this morning. There's a lot of Conservative discontent. You know, Rishi Sunak's been around for not that long, obviously around for a long time as Chancellor, but we can just show you there's a story on the front page of the Telegraph about the dispute over onshore wind, a suggestion there that the Cabinet Minister, Michael Gove, actually disagrees with the Prime Minister on that. And there's another really interesting piece by Robert Colville in the Sunday Times. Now, he's a very well-connected Conservative, and he's basically making the case there that lots of people in your party think the game's up, it's over, the iceberg is on his way. Is he wrong?
Yeah, I think he is wrong, actually. I just pick up first on the Michael Gove comment. I think that spells real danger for my government. The minute you see cabinet discipline break down, I was in the Liz Truss government, we sort of knew it was over when we lost cabinet collective responsibility. This is the first crack in the wall from Michael Gove. He has got a bit of form on this, I might add. Boris Johnson famously used to call wind turbines the white satanic mills of the north of England when they were building them all over my constituency. He's changed his mind of them. I, to a large extent, have changed my mind, and I'm going to be supporting Simon Clarke and his amendment.
So you will also be going for onshore?
That amendment, because I just think, you know, if you want to know why we should have more renewables, just look at your gas or electricity bill. It's really simple, right? Just look at the bill when it arrives in your inbox or through your letterbox. More widely on colleagues' morale, I do think the government's got quite a narrow window to grip some of these issues and prove that we are competent to the British public. And if we do that, I can absolutely see a path to victory, including winning many of those red wall constituencies again, so I disagree with that article. I don't think it's all over.
But you did just say there's a narrow window to try to grip things.
I think there is quite a narrow. There's only 18 months, you know, really till the next general election. Yeah. And as you know, Laura, as a seasoned political journalist, the last 12 months, no one's really listening. It's all about the election campaign. So we've got about 6 months to get this right. 6
months. And you wrote yourself this week that you have to prove to the younger generation that they can have their dream of owning their own home. I mean, right now, do you feel that your party is offering very much to people who can't get on the housing ladder, people under 40. I mean, the polls suggest at the moment almost no one in the country who's under sort of 45 is listening to your party at all.
Do you know, I wrote that in the Telegraph this week. A few days have passed, I haven't quite changed my mind yet. So I do think we need to improve our offer to young people. And the truth is, as Conservatives, if you are going out and selling the idea of capitalism as the best system to drive wealth in this country and improve your own life and family's chances, you need to show how people can own capital in our economy, whether that's owning shares, which very few people do. For most of us, the capital, the stake you have in our economy is owning your own home. And if that slips from the grasp of an entire generation of young people, with people now expecting to rent, particularly in London, into their 40s, it's very hard to persuade them to vote Conservative. That's a battle I think we'll lose.
Jake, there's a bigger picture too. I mean, we've all seen the figures. We've had Conservative rule for 12 years. Britain is bottom of the league on growth, on investment, on living standards for working people, with working people facing another 2 years of a real hit in their living standards. 1 in 3 public servants actively considering quitting the job. Nurses in tears because they are working 14-hour shifts with no relief, looking after far too many elderly dependent people at once and feeling that weight of responsibility. And, you know, it feels incredibly patronising for it to be suggested that a predominantly female profession somehow can get by on another wage cut when they are £5,000 in real terms worse off than they were in 2010.
Well, I hope you're not suggesting that I've made that suggestion, because I haven't.
Well, I think the tone from government, I have to say, in refusing to meet union leaders to negotiate feels incredibly patronising to women and wrong when we're seeing, you know, waiting lists are growing because we haven't got enough people prepared to work in that service. People are leaving the service. That's going to make waiting lists grow. You have got to pay people properly and treat people properly in order to save in the long term.
Okay.
I
hope you heard in my first contribution, I did say, you know, that I thought it had been a mistake actually for government not to meet with trade union leaders earlier, and hopefully that is now going to change.
Well, we will see, and I think in terms of all of this, we're in for a pretty bumpy few weeks, and I'm sure we'll spend more time talking about strikes as they progress in the next couple of weeks. But I want to talk about something that is cheerful, that might lift all of our spirits. Last week we talked to Howard Hugh of NASA, one of the scientists working on the Artemis mission to get people back to the moon. How could you forget, not that we're obsessed with it in this studio or anything, the mission's up there somewhere and it's been capturing some really amazing pictures. Take a look at these. The Artemis 1 mission's Orion capsule, which Howard's in charge of, has successfully done a flyby of the moon. Look at the detail you can see on the surface. It's a lot more than a block of cheese. It's day 11 of the mission now, and the Orion is in what is called distant retrograde orbit. I learnt that this morning. It means flying at about 40,000 miles above the moon, and it will go halfway round before coming home, when it's due to splash down in the Atlantic on the 11th of December. Because as Howard told us, they need the capsule back for the next mission. The pictures are amazing, but the project's a giant chemistry lab too, really. There are no humans up there, but NASA is using the trip to see how some living things react to being in deep space. Hannah, as a scientist and mathematician, just give us a sense of the kind of complexities involved to get something like this off the ground.
Oh, it is absolutely wild. I mean, the whole reason why they have they're putting up an uncrewed mission is because they they expect that there will be problems and hiccups, and they want to fail usefully, and they want to fail usefully in a way that doesn't harm anybody. So inside the capsule they have these mannequins that are hooked up in the normal suits, have all kinds of sensors on them. When the capsule finally comes back down to Earth, they'll be collecting all sorts of data about the sort of extremes that happen on the body. They've called them, instead of mannequins, they've called them moonikins.
Which
is very cute.
I can see what they did there. Now we're going to get you to do some more hard work, because of course there is one big other story that's going on at the moment. Of course it is the World Cup. Wales is hanging on in the competition by the skin of their teeth. England not so impressive on Friday night against the USA. Hannah, you've got your giant calculator out, and we asked you to do some numbers, because one of the brilliant things about World Cups or any big tournament are the upsets, the giant killing moments, and we've seen some of them. What are the chances, the likelihood of upsets in a tournament like this? Can you predict them?
I think you sort of can. So you can do some number crunching based on the FIFA World Rankings. It's actually a system that was originally designed for chess rankings. So it's like it kind of compares the strength of one player against another by how they've done against other similar players. And the thing is that the big upsets that we've had so far, so Saudi Arabia and Argentina, but also Germany and Japan, each of those were pretty unlikely. The Saudi Arabia one in particular, looking at those rankings, about 20% chance that Saudi would have beaten Argentina. The thing is that if you are a fan of that team, right, then yes, you should be really surprised when your team wins. But the chances of any kinds of upsets are actually quite high because, of course, in the World Cup, you have very strong teams who are playing against much weaker teams.
So how high then?
So we did some number crunching. 95.5% chance
really high.
of 2 upsets in that first round.
2 upsets in a tournament, 95%. I'm not sure. I think if I was smarter, I might be able to work out how that could help me at the bookies, but I can't work it out. So I'm going to ask you something else.
The octopus.
Yeah, the octopus. But England and Wales then. All eyes are going to be on the 2 home nations playing each other. What is the chance of a straight England win? Have you worked that out?
Yes, we have. OK, so straight England win, 65%.
Pretty high.
35% chance for Wales. And you may notice there that there's no room for a draw. And that is one of the big failings of these FIFA rankings, is that they, despite it being about football, they don't include the prediction of there being a draw.
That seems like a bit of a miss to me. So
it may be a little bit. Also, I should add, a 1-0 win is the same in their system as like a 6-0 defeat. Okay, so I would say that there is room for improvement there. But you know, just a straight England win, I think you take those numbers with a pinch of salt, but it kind of gives you an indication of what's more likely.
And what about what the Welsh dream 4 goals for them, which, if you put it together with some other results, is what would see them through? What are the chances of that?
That's what they need. The numbers come out at 2.2%.
2%.
But I mean, that is virtually meaningless once you get down to that level.
Have you two been watching the tournament?
I've watched the odd game. I've had it sort of on the background. The only good thing about the World Cup going to Qatar, and there are many, many appalling things about the World Cup going to Qatar, is that the games are early in the morning, so you can sit and work, have it quietly on your laptop and pretend you're doing emails.
OK, so the statistical chance of Wales qualifying is very slim as far as we can see. But football isn't just about statistics, it's about the heart. So we asked legendary Welsh singer Bonnie Tyler for some words of inspiration for her team.
This is the first time we've been in the World Cup for 64 years. So we are good. We got to believe in ourselves. Like my mother always used to say to me, believe in yourself, you know, because we can do it. We can do it. All my band will be all England, I suppose, but, you know, in the nicest possible way. You know, it's only a game after all, but I'm very proud of the Welsh team.
What's your message for the squad, Bonnie?
Give them hwyl, boys, you know. Get out there and do it for Wales. If I can do it at get on and do it.
And is there one of your songs, Bonnie, that could put them in the
I
mood?
need a hero! Come on, boys. Gareth, come on.
I think everybody needs a cheerleader like Bonnie Tyler. If you had her on your side, you can do anything. Now, as you know, we love hearing from you on the programme. You can get in touch anytime. You can send us an email at kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk or use the hashtag on social media if you fancy, hashtag BBC Laura K. Remember, the BBC Live page is there with news as it happens, and a bit later, some more thoughts from me. Now, a few minutes ago, we were talking to the Cabinet Minister, Mark Harper, about the prospect of a series of strikes this winter. Sometimes the Tories think they can shrug off that as a political problem by pointing to Labour's links with the union movement. So where does Labour stand? Let's find out with Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, who joins us from Wigan. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning. How do I follow Bonnie Tyler?
I don't know, but let's see how you get on. Firstly, would public sector workers be better paid under a Labour government?
Yes, I believe that they would. Not just because we would treat them as partners, as the Welsh Labour government has been doing over in Wales, which has averted many of the strikes that we've seen here in England, but also because we have a plan to grow the economy and make sure that that money goes back into people's pockets. The truth is that unless you get a grip on the economy, you'll never have enough proceeds to be able to pay people and reward people fairly, because the cost of living crisis is out of control. That's why we've said we'll invest in clean energy and emerging technologies all over the country in order to get good jobs back into communities that have seen them disappear, money back into people's pockets and the economy growing again.
So you say you would pay public sector workers more, but how much more? Would you give people pay rises that match inflation?
Well, the key is to bring inflation down so that you're not continually watching inflation and the cost of living outstripping what people are earning. And that's why we've said that we would publish all OBR forecasts. We would always have an independent assessment of our spending before we make it, and we'd have an office for value for public money so that we made sure that every single penny was spent wisely. And it's also why I've set out plans to devolve power to mayors and councils to make sure that those who are much closer
but Lisa Nandy, that's a
to our
specific question. You say public sector workers would get more. Would you give them inflation matching pay rises? That's a specific question.
Well, right now it would be absurd for me to open a negotiation live on television. We haven't been invited into the negotiations. We haven't had the books open to us by Mark Harper or by Stephen Barclay.
But you're attacking the government for refusing to give public sector workers
that, with no knowledge behind that.
But it's a question of principle, Lisa Nandy.
Sorry,
would you or would you not, though, match inflation? I'm not asking you to open a negotiation. It's a question of principle. With inflation up at where it is, would a Labour government give people pay rises at that kind of level of 10% increases?
Look, we want to see people paid enough money to live on and rewarded fairly for the contribution that they make. But what you're asking me is not, would we match inflation? You're asking me to commit to a specific number without having been invited into the negotiations and seeing the books. What I can tell you is that we think it's unconscionable that nurses and rail workers who went out and kept this country moving during a pandemic are not being paid enough to put food on the table. We're looking at every single way that we could help with that, including a long-term plan for the economy, and getting more resources very quickly in the first 100 days of a Labour government into the National Health Service through scrapping non-dom tax status so that we can ease the workforce pressures. There's a real capacity problem in the NHS. People are very burnt out, and that is compounding the cost of living crisis. So we're going to use every means at our disposal to help people because they deserve it and because the country can't go on like this.
But if you believe workers deserve it, can you give workers watching this morning, or the rest of our viewers, any sense of the kinds of increases that you might support? 5%, 7%, 15% like the barristers got? Can you give us any sense of the kind of number that would be acceptable?
Well, I could do that, but I would have to pluck it out of thin air because we haven't seen the books, we haven't been invited into the negotiations, and so it's not possible for me to tell you what's affordable. What's worse than that, though, is not that we haven't been invited into the negotiations, but that those workers haven't. The reason that we're facing strike action is because you've got nurses after 106 years who are going out on strike because the Health Secretary refused to meet them all summer in order to negotiate. The only reason he met them is because strike action became a real and looming prospect. That's absurd, isn't it? That you've got a situation where people who earn not enough to put food on the table for their families, who were applauding only a couple of years ago, are having to go on strike, not to meet pay demands, but just to get a meeting and a negotiation started with the people who were supposed to be in their corner.
Well, Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, is now, he says, trying to have negotiations with the Royal College of Nurses, but those strikes clearly are set to happen. Will you join the nurses on the picket line, Lisa?
I'm not going to be on the picket line, I'm going to be in Parliament, because having met with nurses just a couple of days ago, representatives from the Royal College of Nursing and from Unison, they've been absolutely clear with us that they want us to fight their corner, and we will, and they want us to go into Parliament and do our job so that they can do theirs. So that's where I'll be. holding government ministers' feet to the fire, because the truth is we haven't got a militant workforce in this country, we've got a militant government, and it's about time that they started taking seriously the plight of people in every workforce, in public sector work and private sector work across this country.
But are you concerned that there might be a wide series of strikes in all sorts of different sectors? And some in the Labour movement would actually like to see people like you on the picket line alongside them. You went on a picket line with the CWU in the summer. I think we can show viewers a picture of that. And some union leaders do want to see prominent Labour figures like yourselves alongside them.
I think what those workers want most of all is for us to go and fight their corner and make sure that they get the funding and the support into their services and into their pay packets that they deserve. And at the moment, the best way to do that is for us to be in Parliament and putting the pressure on government ministers. I've never shied away from supporting my constituents. I met with the CWU a couple of days ago to discuss the ongoing issues with Royal Mail. I'll never shy away from standing up for working people. I'm a member of the Labour Party and the clue is in the name. But on every picket line I've stood on over the last 12 years, the dispute in the end has been resolved by people getting round the table. The nurses that I met a couple of days ago left me in no doubt that they are desperate to resolve this and avoid strike action. Now, they're doing their job, we're going to do ours, now we need the government to step up and do theirs.
Now, a big part of your job as Shadow Levelling Up Secretary is to push on housing and issues about sorting out inequality in different parts of the country. Housing is such a big part of this for everybody. How many houses would a Labour government build in its first year if you win the election?
Well, we haven't set a number on that at the moment, although we are planning to do that in advance of the general election. One of the reasons that we haven't is that we've seen huge upheaval in the housing market in the last few weeks. In 44 days, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng crashed the economy and sent interest rates soaring. And one consequence of that is not just that mortgages have been withdrawn, but that developers are now sitting on land because they believe there isn't a market there to continue to build. So we've got a fast-moving situation with significant problems that have emerged, but we have committed that the next Labour government will ensure that 70% of people are able to achieve the dream of home ownership, and that we will return social housing to the second largest form of tenure, which does involve a big programme of house building in order to get the housing stock that we need.
But can you give us a sense of the scale of that? I mean, as you said, Keir Starmer has said he wants 70% of home ownership. You've just said you also want a huge expansion in social housing. I mean, are we talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of extra homes being built every year?
Well, there is a target. I'm not sure if it still exists because it's hard to keep track with this government. It was scrapped and then returned and then scrapped again. But there has been a long-standing target to build 300,000 new homes a year in Britain because of the scale of the crisis that we've got. We've got a huge housing crisis in this country, 1 million people stuck on social housing waiting lists, lots of people in the private rented sector seeing their rents going through the roof, and of course a poor housing stock as well. As you'll know, we've just had this awful case of this little boy, Awab Ishak, in Rochdale, because far too many families are stuck in homes that are not fit for human habitation. This little boy was exposed to prolonged mould and damp and eventually died. We can't go on like this, so we've got to have a large-scale house building programme, and one of the ways that we would do that is to make it much easier for councils to buy land at existing use price and reform the compulsory purchase system so that it became much easier for them to do that, and to ask developers to use it or lose it, essentially. If they're sitting on land for long periods of time just banking the profit that they make, we think that's unacceptable when there's a housing crisis.
And would you
the key question for us actually is not just how much but how.
And would you scrap the right to buy, Lisa Nandy? Some suggestion that you should, because it...
Well, I've always believed in the right to buy and the right to buy your own home. People who take on council homes, live in them for a long time, bring up their families there, and it's a good thing that they're able to stay there and pass that down to their own families if they want to. But the problem with right to buy is that the money was never put back into the system, so every time a home was sold it was lost from the housing stock. That's completely wrong, and I agree with Michael Gove actually, who said earlier this year that right to buy is sustainable if you replace homes like for like. So we'll see what's affordable under the next Labour government, but we support the principle. What we don't support is the deliberate vandalism of our social housing stock, which has left a lot of families
Lisa Nandy, I want to just
in appalling housing
finally
conditions.
ask you about a different question. You stood on for the leadership of the Labour Party in 2020, promising that you would protect freedom of movement. Keir Starmer did the same, promising he would defend freedom of movement. This week, he said something completely different, that he's got no interest in freedom of movement, it cannot return. You have also changed your position. How can you attack the Conservatives for chopping and changing and going backwards and forwards when actually you've done exactly the same thing?
Well, I've always believed in freedom of movement, but only if it's allied to a strong investment in the skills and the opportunities for young people here in Britain. So we haven't changed our position in that respect. What we have
completely changed your position. Keir Starmer used to say he would defend freedom of movement. Now this week he said he's not interested in it. You can't turn back the clock, and this is no longer Labour policy.
Well, what's the route to freedom of movement? Essentially applying to rejoin the European Union in one form or another. That's just not on the table. It's not on the table from European leaders. There's no appetite to reopen negotiations. There's nobody in this country, I think, who wants to go back to years of endless division. But what we should be doing is building a proper immigration system that looks at labour shortages, that invests in the skills of our young people first, and then invites immigrants to Britain to fill those gaps and make a significant contribution. That seems to me a serious plan, not the endless back of a fag packet policies that we have floated by this government that unravel as fast as they're announced.
OK, Lisa Nandy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Great to have you on the programme. Now...
Newscast from the BBC.
My old friends and colleagues have more on the upcoming strikes with a focus on the nursing walkout. That's with Adam Fleming and the team on Newscast on BBC Sounds, where you can subscribe to so you never miss an episode. Now, time for a final last word with our panel. Francis O'Grady, Conservative Jake Berry and the academic Hannah Fry. Jake Berry, listening to Lisa Nandy, what did you reckon?
Well, she kept talking about having a plan, but then they clearly don't have a plan, or if they do have a plan, they're not prepared to talk to us about it. I think there's some really interesting things. First of all, I think the Labour Party doesn't really know where it's going with immigration. I'm proudly from the city of Liverpool, but I don't expect us to create a city that size every single year with 503,000 net migrants coming to the country last year. I think it's as big a problem for the government as it is for the Labour Party. It's a really divisive issue in those red wall constituencies. And secondly, she wasn't really prepared to commit to a new house building programme. I think actually both Conservative and Labour Party will both go into the election promising to outbuild each other in terms of houses to capture those younger voters.
More, Francis, briefly to you, final word.
I think we've had Labour setting out very clear plans for growth and a very clear message to business that that business models need to be built on decent work. That means paying people fairly, treating them fairly, fair pay agreements in areas like social care, where the majority earn less than £10 an hour.
OK, well, I know you two are never going to agree, but it's been interesting hearing you sparring this morning, because I think that's basically a soundtrack we're going to hear a lot of in the next couple of months. Hannah, well, let's end with you in something completely different, because I suspect lots of people have really enjoyed hearing your insights this morning, and they can see a bit more of it on your TV programme, I think next Thursday on BBC Two. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's called The Secret Genius of Modern Life, and someone described it as "Who do you think you are?" but for objects, which I quite like. I thought
you were the genius.
I know.
What a modest title for your programme.
Definitely not, I can assure you, with all of the mistakes that I make in that programme. But it's very light-hearted. It's a playful look at the technology that surrounds us.
Lovely. Well, we like playful in this studio. Next Thursday, you're going to be, you've got yourself at least one extra viewer from Jane Berry this morning. Next Thursday on BBC Two at 8 o'clock, I think, if I've got that right. Now, that is all we've got time for. A huge thanks to my trio at the desk with me, and of course to you for watching. And unless there's something very unexpected, we are likely to witness a series of strikes, the like of which we haven't seen for some years. The government says money's just too tight for big wage hikes, but inflation is eating away at workers' wages, and many of them are determined to fight. We'll get the results of some big strike ballots in the next few weeks. Things could get worse before it gets better. The many disputes are all different, but could add up to one big fat problem for the government. The 2020s are not the 1970s, but Rishi Sunak's government is already getting pummeled at the polls and can ill afford to take the blame for a messy, angry winter of discontent. You can catch up on anything you missed on iPlayer. I'll see you there or see you here next week. Good luck to England and Wales, of course. Goodbye for now.